Welcome back. We're at the Students for Liberty Conference at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And this segment I want to talk about war. Except I don't really, because I don't like talking about what I'm not knowledgeable about. And I spent my entire career talking about free markets and consumerism and psychology and medicine. And defense, I left to those other people. And I work at Fox with a bunch of very smart people who are convinced that we need to be in all those countries. And we need to spend, as we are, a fifth of our budget on defense. They say we should spend more. So I'll let David Bose start with that, because most libertarians are skeptical about that.
That's right, John. I think for centuries, libertarians, classical liberals, whatever term they went by at the time, have been concerned, horrified by the impact of war on society. For centuries, war was totally devastating. It killed lots of people, it destroyed societies, it destroyed families and businesses, it wrecked the economy, it wrecked the treasury, cost the taxpayers money for years and years to come. Right now, the United States is involved in a couple of wars that are not as devastating as that. The war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. Pretty devastating in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it's kind of easier here in the United States for us to ignore it because it's not, for a rich country, for a country as big as we are, not as much of an impact as wars used to have. But the same things are still there. We have spent something like $1 trillion on these two wars. Has it been worth it? Has it been worth a few thousand American lives and a lot more lives of people in Iraq and Afghanistan? And I think it hasn't. I think it's time to get out of these wars, bring the troops home, and one of the things it's time to do is for the United States to reduce its military footprint, its intervention around the world, because part of what that's doing, John said there are people all over the world who want to kill us. One of the reasons they want to kill us is we occupy their countries. We send American troops. We send American troops into their countries, and that makes people mad. There's a scholar at the University of Chicago who has pretty well demonstrated the most significant generator of terrorism is a country being occupied by a foreign power. We ought to ratchet back from that.
So I invite you to the microphone to comment about this. And while you come, let me ask you, David, Saddam Hussein supported terrorism. Plenty of people with whom I work say we needed to go in there, establish a beachhead of freedom, a freedom society in the middle of the Middle East. And it seems to have been kind of successful. The surge, which was vilified by the left, seems to have brought peace to Iraq. Maybe it's the role model for Egypt. Justified.
If it's brought peace to Iraq, then why aren't our troops home? Apparently we haven't brought peace to Iraq, which is why we're still there. And even if it had, you still have to ask, was it worth $500 billion?
Yes, next.
Hi, my name is Alex McHugh. I'm with the American University here in D.C. During the Bush era, we saw a lot of support for the anti-war movement. It was very vocal, it was very visible. Where do you think that support has gone? Why has it left us, and where is it?
Boy, that is a really good question. Where is the anti-war movement?
It was probably mostly an anti-Bush movement, and now he's gone. But go ahead.
I work at the Cato Institute in downtown Washington. For 8 years, there was never a day that there wasn't an anti-war protest being advertised on the light pole in front of our building. Not by us, but just by, anti-war activists who would put these posters up. January 20th, 2009, those posters disappeared and they haven't come back. And John's right. The obvious, easy suggestion is these people weren't anti-war. They were only anti-Bush, and they're not anti-Obama. Another answer, I guess, is Obama said he would end the wars. And so they kind of retired. And it's taken them a while to figure out the wars aren't over. It's taken a long time for them to figure it out.
John Russell from the University of Nevada, Reno. True or false? Slaughtering innocent people is never justified.
I would say false. I think we had to kill innocent people to end World War II.
Slaughter is a charged term, and so slaughtering...
How about murder?
Well, murder actually means the unjustified killing. That's its definition. Right. So unjustified killing is never justified as a tautology. I agree with that.
But our bombs killed children. It's not justified to kill children.
That's right. If someone attacks you and you have to respond, but it's terrible to kill innocent people. In the American Revolution, innocent people were killed. Was it justified? Well, I think it probably was, to get the occupying British power out of the United States and allow us to be a free and independent country. But it's not something to be taken lightly. It is not something to be undertaken lightly. We should have a very good reason, and self-defense or national independence are basically the only reasons.
Hi, I'm Corey Moore from Kent State University. Back in the 1960s, obviously, we had a draft in this country, and that was the reason the anti-war movement was so big during the time. What are your thoughts on military recruiting on campuses, high school campuses, college campuses? Do you think that it's something that the government should be doing?
The military is a legitimate function of government. It is essential to have a military to defend our country, and therefore it is absolutely appropriate for them to recruit everywhere they can. And I will say, one thing I don't think we want is a military that has no representation from our college-educated and our Ivy League-educated. So I'm happy to see the military recruit. But the question you started with, I think, is significant. There was a very powerful anti-war movement when there was a military draft. And clearly, one of the reasons we don't have a powerful anti-war movement today is that we're not drafting people and threatening to send them off unwillingly to war. I don't want a draft, but I understand we'd have a stronger anti-war movement if we did have one.
Thank you.
Later in the show, we'll talk about another war, the war on drugs. But when we come back, we'll talk about the budget and how they're spending us into the tank. We're back at the Students for Liberty Conference in Washington, D.C. And now we want to talk about the budget. Government has to spend some money. How much? David Bose says this is our biggest problem.
I look out at young people here, and I think what my generation and the generation older than me is leaving for you. In 1980, the national debt of the United States was $1 trillion. That was a lot of money. But in just 30 years, it's gone from $1 trillion to $14 trillion. And you know, you might say if you have to win World War II or solve the Great Depression, maybe you need to run up a debt. We haven't had a World War II or a Great Depression in the past 30 years. We've had a pretty prosperous period, and yet we've run up $13 trillion in debt. Every president does it. Every Congress does it. They spend on all sorts of things. They spend on the military. They spend on farm subsidies. And the big thing they spend on is what they call entitlement programs. And they call them entitlement programs because they want everybody to think you're entitled, and therefore they can't do anything about it. But the fact is, everything in the federal budget was voted in there by Congress, and your generation is going to pay for that through taxes that will destroy the economy or inflation that you will have to pay for.
All right, you're clapping, but you want to throw the old people out on the street? You know, that's what entitlements are. Yes, ma'am.
Karina Zanat from the American University in Washington, D.C. A lot of my professors seems to think that even when politicians spend money in seemingly wasteful ways, we should be okay with it because every dollar spent is $1 that goes towards income for an American citizen. What are your thoughts on that idea?
What your professors fail to see and the politicians fail to see is that every dollar they spend is a dollar that is taken from somebody else. And it's the... It reminds me of this book your group puts out. What what your professors won't tell you, it's the selected works of Bastiat, and one of his stories was the broken window theory, that somebody breaks a window, and our politicians, Harry Reid, would say, wow, that creates 2 jobs, the janitor to clean it up and job for a glassmaker to replace the window. But what he doesn't see is the money to pay the glassmaker and the janitor were taken from somebody who might have bought a shirt or a pizza or gone to the movies, and that takes away jobs. And your professors apparently don't get that.
And it's not just a wash, because it's not just that, well, John doesn't have the dollar, now I have it. It is that the private sector will spend and invest the money more effectively, more efficiently. You will get more jobs and more wealth creation when money is spent by people in the marketplace than when it is spent by politicians.
Brian Green from the University of Chicago. My question is, what do you each think both of the political feasibility and ultimately the effectiveness of ratifying a balanced budget amendment to get federal spending under control?
Well, politically it's a real challenge. Economically it would be a good idea. Government should not be able to spend more than it takes in. Some economists would make the case that, well, in some years you should run a deficit, in some years you've run the surplus. Well, we've been running that experiment now for 30 years. They never run the surplus. So now that we know that they will only run deficits, we should stop them from doing it.
Hi, Meg Patrick, George Mason University in Fairfax. According to the Austrian business cycle theory, the bust
Let me interrupt you here. I mean, the Austrian business cycle theory. How often... I don't get to hear that very often, so yes, go ahead.
Couldn't you call it something like the happy business cycle theory? It would sound more compelling.
So according to the Austrian business cycle theory, or the happy business cycle theory, the bust is a necessary flip side to a boom. So do you think the injection of fiscal stimulus into the economy disrupts the signals necessary to fix the current problems?
It sure does. I mean, the signals necessary are failure. And if you're not allowed to fail, you don't get the market signals to behave in a prudent fashion. And they didn't, and they loaned like crazy, and they're doing it again.
You know, if you get drunk, you have a hangover. I'm sure there are some of you who have tried the theory, just keep drinking. But you can't keep drinking forever, and you can't keep the bubble going forever.
And sadly, when politicians get drunk, other people get hangovers. And when we return, we will talk about Republicans and Democrats versus Libertarians. Is there really a difference between Democrats and Republicans?